orchestrated Canadian military canine narrative with original characters and authentic details. Orchestrated Canadian military canine narrative with original characters and authentic details. The blood pooling under the fluorescent lights of the ambulance bay was the wrong shade for a person. Too dark, almost black where it spread across the salted concrete, and it was coming out of something with 4 legs and a chest, the size of a beer keg, heaving, going still, heaving again. It was 19 minutes past 2 in the morning, the worst night of the worst storm Pembroke had seen in 11 years, and the thing dying on the floor of Northwood Regional was a dog. Hours earlier, before any of it, Cara Whitlock had been standing at the nurse's station eating cold fries out of a paper bag and listening to the wind try to take the roof off. She was 31. She had been a registered nurse for 6 years, the last 4 of them in this exact emergency department, a low brick building on the edge of town that served Pembroke and Petawawa, and the scatter of small places of the Ottawa Valley where the snow came sideways and the cell service quit. She liked the night shift. She liked the quiet between the bad things, the way the department settled at 2 a.m. into a kind of held breath. She did not like January. Nobody who worked emergency in the valley liked January. "Black ice on the 17, said Priya Sandhu, coming out of the doctor's lounge with a coffee she would not finish. Dr. Sandhu was the only physician on, and she had the flat, scraped-out voice of someone in hour 10 of a 12. OPP's saying white out past Chalk River. They've closed it both directions. Closed it, Cara repeated. So nobody's coming in. So nobody's coming in by ambulance from the north anyway. Everything's going to take longer. Sandhu blew on the coffee. If something big happens up there tonight, it's coming to us or it's not coming at all. Cara thought about that and then put it where she put most things on shift. In a drawer in the back of her mind she could open later. She finished the fries. She checked on the old man in Bay 3, a retired millwright named Frank Delisle, who'd come in with chest pain that turned out to be heartburn and a loneliness he wouldn't name, and who she'd let stay because his furnace had quit and the warming center was full. She refilled his ginger ale. She straightened the blanket over his knees, and he caught her wrist with a hand like a bundle of dry sticks and said, "You're a good girl, you know that." And she said, "Don't tell anybody, Frank. You'll ruin my reputation." And he laughed, and that was the last easy moment of the night. The doors blew open at 2011. Not the ambulance doors. The front ones, the public ones, slamming back on their hinges with a gust that carried snow 10 feet into the waiting room, and through it came 2 soldiers in combat dress with the cold rolling off them in a fog. And between them, half-carried, was a third man whose left side was dark and wet, and behind them, dragging the dog by a makeshift sling of webbing and a coat, was a fourth. "We need help," the fourth one shouted, and his voice cracked on the second word, and Cara was already moving. She got the picture in pieces the way you always did. A military vehicle, one of the small ones, had gone off the 17 north of the base in the whiteout, rolled twice into the ditch. 3 soldiers on a night movement, the man being carried. Master Corporal Jonah Beckett, 26, a gash across his scalp and a left arm that hung wrong, had been driving, and the dog had been thrown. "There's no vet," the fourth soldier kept saying. "A kid really, maybe 20, his face gray. There's no vet open. The clinic in Petawawa's an hour and the road shut. I called everybody. He's our dog. He's..." And then he ran out of words and just stood there holding the bloody webbing. Cara made the decisions in the order they had to be made. Beckett first. He was a person. He was hers. That was not even a question. She and the night's lone orderly, big quiet man named Marcus, got him onto a gurney and into a trauma bay, and Sandhu was on him in seconds, and his vitals were ugly but holding, and within 4 minutes it was clear he was going to live. The 2 other soldiers had walked in under their own power and had nothing worse than a cracked wrist and a face full of safety glass between them. And the dog was bleeding to death on the floor of the ambulance bay where they'd set him down, because nobody knew where else to put him. Cara crouched next to him. A Belgian Malinois, she'd learned later, though right then she only registered tan fur and black muzzle and a body built like a coiled spring, now uncoiling, going slack. He had a deep laceration along the right flank, and a back leg that was clearly broken, and a belly that was tight and wrong in a way she didn't like. His gums, when she lifted his lip, were the color of wet newspaper. His breathing was fast and shallow. He was in shock and he was bleeding internally, and he had maybe minutes. She knew it wasn't allowed. She knew it the way you know a thing in your spine before your brain catches up. This was a human hospital. There were rules, there was liability, there was a whole architecture of policy built around the simple fact that you do not treat animals in a Class A emergency department. She knew all of it. She looked at the kid soldier holding the webbing. She looked at the dog's eye, which was open, and which was looking back at her with a terrible patient calm. The look of something that had decided this was how it ended, and was waiting politely for it to be over. "Marcus," she said, "get me the trauma cart, and the lighter of saline, the warmed one, and the biggest pressure dressing we've got." That was the moment, if you wanted to find one. That was where everything that came after came from. She worked on the dog for 40 minutes on the floor of that bay, on her knees in his blood, with her good scrub pants soaking through. She didn't have a vet's training, but she had a trauma nurse's hands and a trauma nurse's eye. And a dying body is a dying body. Pressure, fluids, warmth, time. She packed the flank wound and held it. She got a line into a vein in his foreleg on the second try, her fingers steady, and ran the warm saline, and watched the gray gums go from wet newspaper towards something closer to pink. She splinted the back leg with a Sam splint and roller gauze and a lot of apology. The young soldier knelt across from her the whole time with his hands in the dog's ruff, murmuring to him, "Stay, Rebel, stay, you stay with me." And Cara understood the dog's name was Rebel, and filed it next to everything else. At tum 51, the dog lifted his head an inch off the floor and licked the soldier's wrist, once. And the soldier put his face down into the dog's neck, and his shoulders shook. And Cara, who had been a nurse long enough to have built some very good walls, felt one of them go. By 3, the worst of it was past. Rebel was stable, or stable enough, alive, warm, his bleeding slowed, his breathing easier. They'd gotten them onto a tarp, and then onto a spare gurney in the corner of the bay, where Beckett, conscious now and stitched, could see him, and the master corporal had wept openly at the sight. This hard young man with 23 staples in his scalp, weeping because the dog was breathing. "He's a working dog," Beckett told her, his voice thick. "Explosive detection. He's been with me 3 years. Latvia. He's topped." "Thank you." "I don't thank you." Cara was peeling off her bloody gloves, and her hands were shaking now that they were allowed to. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "He needs a vet and an x-ray and probably surgery, and none of that's here. But he'll make the ride now. That's all I did. I bought him the ride." She should have been happy. For about 20 minutes, scrubbing pink water off her forearms at the sink, she almost was. Then Marlene Dunmore arrived. The director of clinical operations did not, as a rule, come in at 3 in the morning during a storm. She lived 20 kilometers out, and she was a person of routines, and the routines did not include this. But Northwood was a small place, and small places have phones, and somebody, Cara never did find out who, though she had her suspicions, had called her at home to tell her that the night nurse had a dog in a trauma bay. Dunmore came in still wearing her good wool coat over what was clearly a nightgown, and her face was set in the particular way it set when she had decided a thing before she had seen it. She was a woman of about 55 who had not done bedside nursing in 20 years, and who spoke, always, in the calm, bloodless register of someone for whom the hospital was a budget and a liability profile and an org chart, and only incidentally a place where people were kept from dying. She stood in the door of the trauma bay, and she looked at the dog. She looked at the soldier asleep in the chair beside it. She looked at the bloody tarp, the used supplies, the saline bag, the splint, and then she looked at Cara, and she said, in that calm voice, the thing Cara would replay for weeks afterward. "What in God's name have you done?" It was not a question. It did not go up at the end. What followed happened fast, and it happened in the hallway, because Dunmore had the sense, at least, to take it out of the bay where the soldiers could hear. But the walls were thin and they heard plenty. "That is hospital property." Dunmore's finger came up, pointed at the saline, the cart, the dressings. That is a controlled environment. Do you have any idea of the liability you've exposed this facility to? An untrained animal, an uncontrolled animal, in a sterile trauma bay. If that thing had bitten someone, if it has rabies, if a patient had come in, and that bay was occupied by a dog. No patient came in, Cara said. The highway's closed, the bay was empty, the dog was dying. You're not a veterinarian. No, I'm a trauma nurse, and a dying body doesn't care which. It was the wrong thing to say. It was true, and it was the wrong thing to say, and she watched it land in Dunmore's face and harden there. You used hospital supplies off protocol on a non-patient without physician authorization. Dr. Sandhu knew. Did Dr. Sandhu document it? Did you document it? Did you obtain consent? Did you... Dunmore stopped and pressed 2 fingers to her own temple, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone very quiet and very final. You acted on your own, off policy, and you exposed this hospital to a risk you are not in a position to evaluate. I'm relieving you of the rest of your shift. You'll go home, and Tuesday you'll meet with me and HR. And I'll be very honest with you, Cara. I don't see how this doesn't end your time here. For a moment, Cara couldn't make a sound come out. She was aware of Marcus in the background pretending to chart, of Sandhu coming out of the lounge with her face going dark, of the young soldier standing now in the door of the bay, having heard all of it, his fists at his sides. There's still a department to run, Cara said finally. I'm the only nurse on. You're sending me home in a storm and leaving you with no. I'll cover the floor myself until day shift, Dunmore said. Get your things. So she got her things. That was the part she'd think about most, oddly. Not the shouting, not the word relieved. The part where it gets small and procedural and humiliating in a way the movies never show. She went to the staff room and got her coat off the hook. Her good parka she'd bought on sale at the Marks in the strip mall by the Tim Hortons, and she had to dig her toque and mitts out of the sleeves where she'd stuffed them. She opened her locker, and there was her travel mug, and her spare runners, and a granola bar, and a photo of her sister's kids taped inside the door, and she didn't know whether she was supposed to clear it all out now or Tuesday, and the not knowing was its own small cruelty, so she left it. She found her car keys at the bottom of her bag. Dunmore walked her to the staff exit like she was a shoplifter, the wool coat creaking, and at the door said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, "Drive safe. The roads are bad," and let her out into the storm. Cara sat in her Corolla in the dark parkade for a long time before she could make her hands turn the key. The snow ticked against the windshield. Across the lot, through the falling snow, she could see the lit windows of the department, the place she had given 6 years and 100 Christmases and every good clean thing she had, and she watched it and she cried, the way you cry when you're too tired and too humiliated to do it gracefully, ugly and gulping, alone in a cold car at 3:40 in the morning. She did not yet know about the dog. She did not know what Rebel was, or what he'd done, or who was coming. They'll Satch. Hugh's the part Cara wasn't there for, the part she had to be told later, and it started about 40 minutes after she drove home through the whiteout with her wipers barely keeping up. Master Corporal Beckett, stable and staples and all, had refused to be admitted until he'd made a phone call. 2 phone calls, actually. The first was to the duty officer at Garrison Petawawa to report the rollover and the status of his people and his dog. The second was harder to make, and he made it anyway, because that was the kind of soldier he was, and it was to a man named Lieutenant Colonel Desmond Hale. Hale was the commanding officer of the unit Beckett and Rebel belonged to. Not a unit whose name got said much out loud, the kind whose members wore no flashes, and whose movements at 2 in the morning on a closed highway were nobody's business. And Hale knew Rebel. Everybody in that unit knew Rebel. 18 months earlier, on a deployment to Latvia that the news had described only as a training and reassurance mission, Rebel had alerted on a roadside culvert that a brand new vehicle-mounted detection system, a system procured at great cost from a contractor whose name was on a building in Ottawa, had swept clean and called safe. The system had been wrong. The culvert had not been safe. Rebel's alert, which 2 officers had nearly overruled because the expensive machine had said otherwise, had stopped a vehicle 11 meters short of an IED large enough to have killed everyone in it. Among the everyone had been Master Corporal Jonah Beckett and a captain, and a young trooper on his first tour. 3 families who still had their soldier because a dog believed his own nose over a machine that a company had sold the crown knowing it would later quietly emerge that it failed in cold and wet. That last part, the knowing, was the thing that had a small, careful inquiry grinding away in the background of Hale's life that winter. The thing that made certain people in Ottawa wish very much that the matter of a Belgian Malinois named Rebel would stay obscure and unremarkable. Rebel was, whether he knew it or not, the best living witness to a piece of equipment fraud that several well-connected people preferred buried. So when Beckett got Hale on the phone at 4 in the morning and said, "Sir, we rolled the vehicle, I'm okay, the boys are okay, but Rebel's hurt bad, and a nurse here saved his life, and now they fired her for it." Lieutenant Colonel Hale was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Say that again, slowly." Dilsatch. The day shift came on at 7. By 8, the storm had broken into that hard, bright stillness that follows a valley blizzard. The sky scrubbed blue, the snowbanks blinding. By 9, Marlene Dunmore had begun composing, on her office computer, the careful incident report that would frame the night's events as a serious deviation from protocol by a nurse, with, she would write, a documented pattern of independent decision-making. She had already used the word liability 4 times. She was reaching for a 5th when the front doors of Northwood Regional opened. They came in out of the white morning the way the storm itself had come in, all at once and with the cold rolling off them, not Navy SEALs. This was Canada, and the people who came through those doors at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning wore the maple leaf, though their uniforms carried no unit identification. A civilian could read. 2 of them in combat dress with rifles slung and the particular economical stillness of men who did not waste movement. Behind them, in service dress, his beret tucked under one shoulder strap and 4 decades of restraint in his face, Lieutenant Colonel Desmond Hale, and behind him, walking slowly, his arm in a sling and his scalp shaved and stapled, refusing the wheelchair the staff kept trying to give him, Master Corporal Jonah Beckett, who had checked himself out against medical advice that morning for exactly one reason. The day charge nurse, a sensible woman named Helen, met them at the desk and asked, with admirable steadiness, how she could help. "Lieutenant Colonel Hale," Hale said, "Canadian Armed Forces. I'm here about a member of my unit who was treated here last night." A pause. "And about the nurse who treated him. And about a dog." Word travels in a small hospital faster than any system. By the time Hale had finished that sentence, Marlene Dunmore was already coming down the corridor in her good blazer with her hand out and her administrator's smile in place, the smile that had smoothed over 100 complaints and quieted 100 families, and she said, "Colonel, I'm so glad you've come. We were, of course, very concerned about your soldier, and we did everything." "Master Corporal," Hale said. Dunmore blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Master Corporal Beckett. He has a rank. You can use it." Hale's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "And I'd ask you, please, not to tell me what you did. I've been told what you did. I've been told what you did. I'd like to hear it from the nurse who did it. Where is she?" The smile flickered. She's not on shift. There was an incident last night, an unauthorized." "You sent her home," Beckett said. It was the first thing he'd said, and it came out rough. "In the storm, after she spent 40 minutes on her knees keeping my dog alive on your floor because there was no vet who could reach us, you sent her home and told her she was fired." The waiting room had gone very quiet. Frank Delisle, who had not, in the end, been able to go home because his furnace was still dead and the warming center still full, sat in his wheelchair by the window where the day staff had let him stay, and watched all of it with the bright, attentive eyes of a man who'd waited 80 years for something interesting to finally happen at the hospital. "There are protocols," Dunmore began, and her voice had thinned. "An animal in a trauma bay represents a significant." "I'd like to tell you about this animal," Hale said. And he did. He stood in the lobby of Northwood Regional Hospital in his service dress, in front of the day staff and 3 patients and a retired millwright in a wheelchair, and the director of clinical operations whose face was slowly draining of its color, and he told them, in plain, unhurried sentences, about a culvert in Latvia, 18 months before. about a machine that cost the taxpayers of Canada a sum he named, and that had been certified safe, and had swept the road clean, and had been wrong. About a dog who had not been wrong. About 11 meters, about 3 soldiers who were alive. He gestured, with no drama at all, to the young man beside him with a stapled scalp, and the families who still had them. He did not raise his voice once. That dog, Hale said, is named Rebel. He is a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. He has done more for this country than most people will do in a lifetime, and last night he nearly died in your ambulance bay. And the reason he is, this morning, recovering at a veterinary surgery in Ottawa instead of lying frozen in the ditch on Highway 17, is that one of your nurses decided that a dying thing was worth saving even when your rule book told her it wasn't her job. He let that sit. I came here to thank her. I'm told instead that you fired her, so I'll ask you one more time, and then I'm going to start making telephone calls that you would very much prefer I didn't make. Where is she? And what is her name? It was Frank Delisle, of all people, who answered. Cara, he said, from his wheelchair, loud and clear and shaking with the pleasure of it. Her name's Cara Whitlock, and she's the best nurse in this whole damn place, and you people ought to be ashamed. Dilsach. The phone in Cara's apartment rang at 9:40. She'd slept maybe 2 hours, had given up, and was sitting at her kitchen table in Pembroke with a coffee going cold and her resume open on her laptop and a feeling in her chest like a stone, when the call display said Northwood Regional, and her stomach dropped because she assumed it was HR moving up the meeting, making it official. It was Helen, the day charge, and Helen's voice was doing something strange. Cara, she said, you need to come in. Helen, I was sent home. I'm not supposed to. There's a lieutenant colonel standing in our lobby, Helen said, and he won't leave, and the dog you saved last night was a special forces dog that stopped a bomb in Latvia, and the soldier you saved checked himself out of bed to come here. And Marlene's in the conference room with 2 people from the Regional Health Authority who drove up from Renfrew this morning, and Cara. Ellen took a breath. You need to come in. Right now. Come in the front. Cara came in the front. She had not changed out of the clothes she'd thrown on. She had not done anything with her hair. She came through the doors of Northwood at 10:15 in the morning in her parka and her toque, into a lobby that went quiet when they saw her. And there was a colonel in service dress, and there were 2 soldiers with rifles slung, and there was the master corporal whose dog she'd splendid, his face breaking open into something raw and grateful, and there was Frank Delisle in his wheelchair, beaming like it was Christmas. Hale crossed to her. Up close he was older than the uniform suggested. His face seamed, his eyes pale and direct. He stopped a careful distance away the way you approach someone who's been through it, and he said, Ms. Whitlock? Yes. Her voice came out small. My name is Desmond Hale. Last night you saved the life of a dog named Rebel. Rebel saved the life of that man and 2 others 18 months ago. He paused. I've spent the morning learning that you were fired for it. I'd like you to know that's not going to stand. But first, I'd like to do the thing I actually came here to do, which is shake your hand, if you'll let me, and tell you thank you on behalf of a unit that is in your debt, whether they ever meet you or not. And he put out his hand. Cara would tell people later that she didn't remember shaking it. She remembered the lobby. The snow light coming in the big windows, Frank crying without embarrassment in his chair. Beckett's stapled head bent, the strange weightless feeling of a thing tipping over inside her from grief into something she had no word for. She remembered that she said, stupidly, Is he okay? The dog? Is Rebel okay? Before she said anything else, before thank you, before anything about herself. And she watched that register in Hale's face. Watched it confirm for him something he'd already decided about who she was. He came through surgery this morning, Hale said. He's going to keep his leg. The vet says the only reason he made it to her table at all is that someone bought him the time. The colonel's mouth moved, almost a smile. Her word. Bought him the time. I'm told it was yours first. What happened to Marlene Dunmore happened more quietly than the part in the lobby, and it took longer the way real consequences do. She was not arrested in a hallway. Nothing so cinematic. But the two people from the regional health authority who'd driven up from Renfrew that morning had not, in fact, come about a dog. They had come because the inquiry grinding away in Ottawa over a certain defective detection system had, in its slow, methodical way, begun pulling threads. And one of those threads led to the contractor's local arrangements, and one of those arrangements concerned a hospital procurement file and a director of clinical operations who had, over several years, steered certain equipment contracts toward certain companies in exchange for considerations that did not appear in any minutes. The dog and the nurse were never the real story to those two people. They'd simply arrived on the same cold morning and watched Marlene Dunmore stand in a lobby and tell a lieutenant colonel that a wounded military dog represented an unacceptable liability, and they had formed, the way people do, a clear and lasting impression of her judgment. Dunmore was placed on administrative leave by the end of that week. She did not come back. The fuller reckoning took the better part of a year, and most of it never made the Pembroke paper. But it made the part that mattered. A woman who had reduced a hospital to a liability profile discovered that she was, herself, a liability, and was managed accordingly. Cara Whitlock was reinstated the same afternoon she walked back in. The regional authorities saw to that within the hour. There was a great deal of motivation suddenly to be seen doing the right thing. She was offered an apology she didn't fully believe and a small raise she hadn't asked for, and 6 months later, a charge nurse position she had not applied for and accepted only after Frank Delisle, whom she still visited, told her she'd be a fool not to. But the part she kept, the part she'd take out and turn over on bad nights for the rest of her career, wasn't the reinstatement or the raise or even the colonel's hand. It was 8 weeks later, the first warm Saturday of a late valley spring, when a truck pulled into the lot at Northwood and Master Corporal Jonah Beckett got out, his arm long since healed, and opened the back, and a Belgian Malinois jumped down a little stiffly onto 3 good legs and one that worked well enough, and stood in the parking lot in the sun with his tongue out and his ears up, alive, whole, ridiculous with health. They'd called ahead. Half the day, staff came out to the front to see, and Cara came out last, in her scrubs, wiping her hands on a paper towel, and the dog saw her. She would swear, afterward, against all the reasonable objections of everyone she told it to, that the dog knew, that Reppel, who had met her exactly once, on the worst night of both their lives, while dying on a concrete floor, crossed that parking lot in the spring sun and stopped in front of her, and leaned the whole solid warm weight of himself against her legs and stayed there, the way he must have leaned on Beckett in 100 dark places, and let her put her hand down into the ruff of his neck, where she'd had it 8 weeks before, with his blood running over her fingers. And that this time it was warm, and this time he was breathing easy, and this time nobody was going to tell her it wasn't her job. She crouched down in the parking lot in front of everyone and put her face against the dog's neck, the way the young soldier had that night, and she didn't care who saw, and Rebel held still and let her, patient and calm, the way he'd held still for the splint, and over his back, the Master Corporal looked at her and didn't try to say thank you again because there wasn't any way to say it that would hold the size of it, and the spring wind came up the valley smelling of melt and mud and the first green, and somewhere behind them Frank Delisle, who'd wheeled himself out to watch, said to nobody in particular, "Best nurse in the whole damn place." And for once, Cara Whitlock didn't tell him to keep it down. It took me longer than it should have to see that the worst night of my career and the best one were really the same night, stretched 8 weeks apart, joined by a dog who shouldn't have lived. When Rebel came through those doors bleeding onto the floor of the ambulance bay, I had a rule book in my head telling me he wasn't mine to save. I broke it. Not because I'm brave, I want to be honest about that. I broke it because I couldn't kneel beside a living thing that was dying and do nothing and still call myself a nurse afterward. That part wasn't a decision so much as a refusal. There are lines a person won't cross even when crossing them would be easier. And the older I get, the more I believe that knowing where those lines sit and holding them when it costs you is most of what makes a life worth anything. What I didn't have that night was the sense to see how it would land. I assumed Marlene Dunmore would understand. She didn't, and I think the reason is plain cause and effect. She had spent 20 years turning a hospital into a spreadsheet, and a person who only ever asks what's allowed eventually loses the ability to ask what's right. She wasn't a monster. She'd just stopped looking at what was in front of her. The machine in Latvia did the same thing. It told 3 soldiers the road was safe because the road matched its programming, and Rebel told them the truth because he was paying attention. The difference between Dunmore and that dog was attention. And attention is a kind of intelligence you have to choose every shift when you're dead tired, and it would be so much easier not to. The hardest part wasn't getting fired. It was the parkade afterward, crying in a cold car, certain I'd thrown 6 years away for nothing. Nobody was coming. I genuinely believed that. And then Beckett checked himself out of a hospital bed to stand up for me. And Lieutenant Colonel Hale drove through a closed highway to shake my hand. And Frank Delisle hollered my name from his wheelchair. And I learned the thing I'd want a younger nurse to hear. Doing the right thing rarely pays you back the same day, and you have to be able to outlast the quiet in between. You have to keep your feet under you long enough for the truth to catch up. I don't think I'm special. I just got to keep my hands warm in Rebel's fur a second time in a parking lot full of spring sun, because on the worst night, I didn't let the rule book decide who deserved to live. Hold your line. Watch what's actually in front of you. And when it costs you, stay standing long enough to find out it was worth it.